Okay, we are continuing through the book of Revelation, a very difficult book, especially for me to try to summarize a few chapters at a time, not understanding everything very well myself. But keep in mind a couple big things from the beginning of the book. One, that these are specific words of comfort and encouragement for the seven churches in Roman Asia, and it is for them and what they are about to go through to give them the strength and the challenge that they need. And then from that, anchored in that, we also can take comfort and encouragement. We also want to remember that this type of literature is about revealing behind the scenes what God is up to. It's not about a code that is supposed to be broken down to make predictions about the end of time. These are symbols intended, again, to send a message, to tell us a story about the way that God is working in the world. And so let's pick up where we've been in chapter 8. And I will just say briefly that if we remember, chapter 5 introduced the idea of the scroll with the seals, that only the Lamb had the authority to break, to reveal what it is that God is doing. And so those seven seals begin to be broken in chapter 6. The first four of them showing the chaos and the death that is unleashed on the earth. The fifth of those, the martyrs, cry out to God, God, when are you going to vindicate your people that have been slain? They're told to wait a little while longer until the rest of God's people are killed as well. And then the sixth seal is open at the end of chapter 6, and God is unleashing his terror upon evil on the earth. But there is a break in chapter 7, an interlude where God's people are marked out and protected from the wrath that he is going to pour out upon the earth. Well, in chapter 8, that next seal, that last seal is broken, and all it does is introduces then the seven trumpets that are going to be blown, which symbolize the unleashing of God's wrath. You see a lot of Exodus imagery, especially from the plagues in these chapters. God's wrath, God's judgment is coming upon the earth, upon the nations for their evil. But notice that at the end of chapter 9, it says, in spite of this, all of those that survive this terror still do not repent, and they go on committing their murders, their sorceries, their immoralities, and their thefts. This is the picture of Revelation, that in spite of God's wrath, the nations continue in their rebellion. Well, then in chapter 10, John, like the prophets of the Old Testament, given this scroll, like Ezekiel, told to eat it, given the message from God that he is going to communicate. And that message in chapter 11 involves a picture of the temple that will be trampled by the nations. Remember that in the New Testament, the temple symbolizes the people of God themselves. And also in chapter 11, two witnesses, two olive trees, two lampstands that will stand before the world and speak for God, but yet they will be murdered. These are both, I think, symbols of God's people, God's witnesses, God's prophets, his churches, his people that will stand before the world and represent him and speak for him. And they, following the example of their king, the slain lamb back from chapter 5, they too will be slain. They too will be cut down by, again, the rebellious and evil and wicked nations. Okay, and that wraps up then this series of the scroll, the seals of the scroll and the trumpets that are blown. In chapter 12, we begin a series of stories. This story about the dragon, the serpent of old. We are finally told that that snake back in the garden is Satan himself, the adversary. A woman gives birth to a child, the people of God giving birth to the Messiah. Satan tries to get at him, but he is taken away, as we know. And so Satan is cast down with Jesus' death, resurrection, ascension. The power of Satan is cast down to the earth. And so, for a time, the time that is allotted to him, which is temporary and limited, but still there, Satan has a terror on his people. It's a picture of the attacks of the evil one against God's people for being faithful to their king. But there is still in this a promise that they are being protected by God, that they will have to endure in this wicked world persecution and suffering, even death. And yet it is limited because God's plan is that they will win the victory when God's final judgment is accomplished. And we'll continue to see these images and see how it all works out as we continue in the book. So check back next week for the next video. Thank you.